Welcome to the Living Well Church podcast, and thanks for tuning in today. Our mission as a church is to help people find faith in Jesus and a life of purpose and hope. You're about to watch a message that will challenge you, inspire you, encourage you, and most of all, point you to Jesus and the life of purpose and hope He has planned for you. So lean in and enjoy, and let God speak into your life.
Good morning. How are we all doing? Okay? So, when we were looking at this series of what we're going to be preaching, I set my heart on doing the miraculous in the everyday. We sat there discussing it, and I thought, that's something I could really do justice to, something close to my heart, and it just seemed like it was forming a preach in my head already. And then Marcus had the same idea too. And apparently, as pastor, he pulls rank on me still. So instead, I ended up with outrageous and ordinary, which actually, the more I thought about it, the more it seemed to fit. Because there's one thing I do quite well, I think it's probably outrageous. And in fact, there's nothing too miraculous about me outside of a football pitch. So, some of the outrageous things I do. Over the years, I've had some pretty outrageous haircuts, which should be coming up now. This was in 2002, leading up to the Football World Cup, and if you go to the next one, and was meant to be a St George's cross. It did end up red and white, and I think actually the shirt choice was more outrageous. This, again, I don't know, this is probably the nicest that hair ever looked at that length, the tidiest it ever was, and then I cut it all off because it got a bit boring, and ended up with this. Brooding look and all. And then that went off, came back a couple of years later, longer, and then when that one got boring, I decided to bleach it blonde. And that's a shameless selfie as well. I apologise for that one. But outside of how my hair's been, I also sometimes dress rather outrageously. Those lucky enough to be in my life group will know of my love for short pink shorts. And also, I have a few outrageous pairs of shoes, some of which I'm wearing today. My lovely cowboy boots. Not everyone is a fan of. Now, I also hold a couple of outrageous opinions, which I take as fact. The first one is, purple is the greatest colour. If anyone disagrees, you're wrong. Graham Kendrick is the greatest songwriter of all time, Christian or secular. And finally, the most important one, Sean Bean is the greatest actor to have ever lived. And the only reason he hasn't won an Oscar is because they don't let him run for it each year, because otherwise he'd always win it, and no one else ever would. Now, if anyone disagrees with those 3 points, you can come find me afterwards and I'll pray for you. Now, fortunately, Jesus did outrageous and ordinary in a pretty different way than I do. For starters, he managed to be both outrageous and ordinary, two almost polar opposites. To start with, he was both fully God and fully man, something that only he could be. He was born to a human mother, and just like any other baby, he would not have been able to talk or walk when he was born, and he would have been reliant on Mary too. And because of this, he would have had a very human body. He looked and sounded just like anyone else, and he had new human needs just like everyone else did too. There's two clear examples of this in the Bible, which I'm sure all of us can sympathise with. In John 4, after travelling a long way, he said he was very tired. And then also in Matthew 4, one I particularly sympathise with, he was very hungry. So for the first 30 or so years of his life, Jesus was very ordinary. Other than one mention in the Bible of him when he was 12 or so in the synagogue, there's nothing really recorded about him. He was raised by Joseph, who was a carpenter by trade, and he followed in those footsteps as well. And that's shown as well in the Bible. When he's preaching in a synagogue in his hometown, they recognise him and are surprised that this carpenter is bringing him this message. And then even later on in his ministry, as he taught, he used very ordinary methods too. He used lots of parables and stories to help explain what would otherwise seem like complex issues. So that's some of the ways in which he was ordinary. But how also was he outrageous? So we'll start with what he said about himself. He told people that he was the Son of God, and he showed that with miracles he performed. I've made some pretty outrageous claims in my life. None as outrageous as that, and none which I've ever been able to back up like that. He also kept some outrageous company. He was often seen with tax collectors. And in fact, one of his 12 disciples had been a former tax collector. Tax collectors were despised by the Jews. As far as they were concerned, they were traitors who had sold out to the Romans. The Romans, who they saw as oppressive rulers. And just to give you an idea of how much they hated the Romans, 30 or so years after Jesus died, the Jews raised a rebellion against the Romans. And when the last 950 or so of them who had resisted were surrounded by Roman centurions, instead of giving up and being Roman captives, they one by one killed each other to escape slavery. So that's how much they would have hated the Romans. So these guys had sold out to these people and were taking money to help them instead of fighting them. And to top it all off, they cheated their own people. If you owed the taxman £100, they'd take 150. As evidenced by Zacchaeus, who after meeting Jesus, he sells half his possessions and gives back 4 times the amount he had taken from people. So they were making lots of money, which they shouldn't have been. And again, possibly even worse at the time, Jesus healed a Canaanite girl. The Canaanites, as a group of people, were historically enemies of the Jews, but still he went and he healed, and it just reinforced what he taught with the Good Samaritan. But for me, one of the most outrageous things about Jesus was his expectations of his followers. In Mark 1, he calls James and John to be his disciples. As he's walking along the water, he sees them fishing with their father and his hired hands. And he calls out to them, tells them to follow him, and they do. They drop everything, they leave his father and the people they were working with in the boat and go straight away to follow him. And then later still in Luke 9, he's addressing 3 men, and he tells one of them to follow him. To which he replies, "First, let me go and bury my father." Which Jesus says to that, "Let the dead bury their own dead," which is a pretty bold statement. Now, the point what Jesus was making wasn't that it's wrong to bury your dead or to grieve when someone dies. But in this case, at that time, Jesus wanted that man to make him his first priority and didn't have time for that to happen. Which raised a question. If Chris or Emily or someone else stood here this morning and brought a prophecy and said, "Jake, I want you to go to the Middle East. Go home, get your passport, and get on the first plane," would you go? Yes? No? Yeah? Good. So you would follow like James and John and not try to delay. But how would we then react as a church? Would we support him? Would you think he's crazy to go on just one word with no delay? I think you'd probably be a bit crazy if you did, but I'd try to support you. Now, there's some examples of both outrageous and ordinary ways that Jesus was. But I want to look at one story where he does both at the same time. If you look at the story of Lazarus, found in John 11, ideally I'd read it all 3, but it would take most of the sermon, so I won't. I'd just try and paraphrase it a bit. So Jesus knows Lazarus and his family, and he spent time with them before. And as he's moved on from the region, he's preaching somewhere else. Lazarus' sister sends a messenger to Jesus to tell him that Lazarus is ill, and she is worried he's going to die. Jesus hears this, takes it on board, and then he carries on where he is preaching for 2 more days. And then after those 2 days, he decides he's going to go back to Lazarus. Now, that's the first outrageous thing he does, because where Lazarus is, Jesus and his disciples weren't very welcome. They had left there before because they had been trying to stone them. The Jews disagreed with what he was saying and what he was teaching so much they wanted to kill him. The disciples weren't particularly keen on the idea, and they took some reassurance from Jesus before they decided to follow him. So at this point, he's already going back and risking his own life and his disciples. When they do arrive there, Lazarus' sister Mary comes straight out to them. She throws herself at the feet of Jesus and she weeps because whilst he had been on his way, Lazarus had died. And then Jesus reacts in a very ordinary, human way, in a way I think that all of us would. He's deeply moved, and in a verse which is often quoted, Jesus wept, which is something we wouldn't often imagine, but something that we could all imagine ourselves doing. But the story does not end there, because we have an outrageous and an awesome God. Jesus is so moved that as he goes to the tomb where Lazarus has been buried, when he gets there, he tells them to roll back the stone. Initially, they don't want to. They tell him that he's been dead 4 days, and the smell will be outrageous and awful. But still he persists and tells them to roll it back. And as they do, he calls out to Lazarus, and he tells them to come out. And then Lazarus steps forth, still wrapped in the grave clothes. Now, of all the examples we've had this morning, I think this shows clearly how Jesus was both outrageous and ordinary. So how do we emulate Jesus? Because the Bible is clear that we should. What do we do that is both outrageous and ordinary, that reaches people? Do we go home today and change nothing? Do we do a Zacchaeus and sell half our possessions? Or do we all go join Jake in the Middle East? Now, for the last 2 weeks, myself and Beth have been off Facebook. We wanted to choose something to not do for 2 weeks. We quickly skipped past drinking tea. And we ended up on Facebook, not because Facebook is bad or evil or anything, but because it's something that we both spend a lot of time on. So for me, I spend probably at least an hour a day on just Facebook. I'd get up in the morning, I'd check my news feed, usually see the hockey scores on there, respond to any messages, and then I'd get up. And then I'd check throughout the day, replying to messages, keeping in touch with people all over the world. And then in the evening, the last thing I do before I go to bed would be to check Facebook again. So in giving it up, between us, we both had an hour or so a day free, which we didn't just use as an extra half an hour morning and night to sleep in. Instead, we spent the time praying for 5 non-Christians each. Now, when we did this, I was hoping that all 5 would be here and they were saved, which would make the whole preach a lot easier, and you'd have to listen to me a lot less. But actually, as far as we're aware, there's been very little difference in their lives. However, the reason we're praying for them is because of the most outrageous thing that Jesus did. Because he came and he died on the cross for us, so that each one of us can be saved. That at any given moment, we're all just one prayer away from eternity in heaven with him. And Jesus died not just for the Jews, or for church leaders, or one group of people, for each one of us as an individual. For me as Jack King, for Katie, for Amanda, for anyone here, as an individual. Because of this outrageous love Jesus had for us, he gave up all he had for everything, just for us. So Jesus showed and told us how to love. He says in the New Testament that love God and loving your neighbour are the 2 greatest commandments. So for 2 weeks, we gave up something we like, something we do in our everyday life, to pray for people that we love. And we're hoping that something in a small way that we do, just part of our everyday, ordinary life, has an outrageous effect on someone else's. So there's one thing that I am sure of, and that is if we all go away from today and we show the love of Jesus in our lives to the people around us, then we will see people saved. But what does that look like for us? It's unlikely that any of us are going to join Jake in the Middle East. Maybe some of us will, maybe some of us won't. But God has a plan for each of our lives. Some of us know what that is. Some of us are walking in that at the moment. Some know what it is and are still working on that and getting to that point. But some days it can be as simple as just praying for an opportunity to share the love of God. Some days it might be a hot drink for someone on a cold day, or a hug on a bad day. Just something to remind people of Jesus' love. So there's 2 things we can take away from today. One is that as we go, we pray. We spend time each day praying for a chance in our workplaces, in colleges, in Tiny Toes, anywhere like that, that we can show Jesus' love to others. And the other thing that I want to do is just this morning as we're here, if you are one of those people who don't know what their calling is, doesn't know the plan God has for your life, I just want to make time for you to come and be prayed for, so you know what that is. And if you're one of the people who know what you're being called for, and you're trying your best to ignore it or work towards it, make space for you to be prayed for that as well. So I'm just going to invite Phil and the worship band back up and hand back over to Katie, and we'll just make space for that.